Welcome back to the channel, everyone, and welcome back to another huge iceberg. Today we are starting to break down the unused and cut video game content iceberg by Silent Chatterbox 52 over on icebergcharts.com. A lot of video games we know today so thoroughly weren't always guaranteed to be the way they were when they shipped. This is where scrapped ideas of varying levels come into play, whether it be simple character palette swaps all the way to extremely cool ideas that could never come to fruition, with only remnants of these ideas left in the game's backends. This is a pretty common thing to do online nowadays, is to see everything a game has to offer, even if it's not intended to be seen. So with all of this snooping around everybody's been doing, there's quite a large list of interesting and strange cut content hiding in our favorite games. So in today's video, we're going to tackle the first two layers of the iceberg, and we will continue the series in the coming weeks. Without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into layer 1. Layer 1 in this iceberg is used as more of a launching point for the topic covering definitions and common terms when dealing with cut content, and what better way to start than debug menus. A debug menu exists with pretty much any program, but is most popular among gamers as it acts as the golden gates to the back end of a game or program. The debug menu is the main way for people to manipulate the program's internals and really see everything under the hood and tinker around with it. This is also a way to break the game, whether it's manipulating the character models or giving yourself a moon jump or something of the matter. Debug menus are sometimes hidden purposely by developers in hopes players don't fuck around in the game and actually experience the game as intended, but other games have pretty simple ways of accessing this menu. The most common that comes to my mind is the Valve games and the infamous tilde key debug menu. But yeah, there isn't much more than just knowing that the debug menu acts like a universal way to access a game's backend. Test levels are used by game developers as a blank room to test just the game mechanics of the game, like player model animation, items, guns, pretty much anything that isn't level or map specific. The most popular ones that come to my mind are from older games like Donkey Kong 64 and Super Mario Sunshine and the likes of that, where back then they would be less Easter eggy and more bluntly just acts as a place to test the game mechanics. Sometimes you can find texture test levels, but oftentimes these will be textureless areas that look like you're playing on a very early version of the game. Take Super Mario Sunshine's test level for example. You can almost tunnel vision it and imagine yourself breaking into Shigeru Miyamoto's house in the early 2000s and loading up the earliest version of Super Mario Sunshine that was playable. Obviously, these types of test rooms were never meant to be seen by players, but more modern games sometimes make it easier to access these test rooms, and often will add stuff like Easter eggs that sometimes feature the game developers themselves. It depends on the game, but if you found yourself in a test room, you're well on your way to excavating the back end of video games. Who knows what you might find next? Perhaps a low-poly model of Luigi's left pinky toe that was cut from the Mafia mission in Luigi's Mansion 2. You don't know what I'm talking about? Exactly. It got cut. Placeholders are used in video games as a temporary asset to be later replaced, whether it be textures, character models, or items. There are many cases for placeholders in games. These 99% of the time are replaced before the game's final release, with the only way to find them being to check the back end of the game. One of my favorite placeholder character models in the back end of a game is the Bomberman model in the back end of Mario Party 2. Since they were both being developed by Hudson Soft, they most likely were testing early development with the already made Bomberman model. A pretty popular and shocking placeholder is Yummer from SpongeBob SquarePants Saves the Day, in which they had a goofy-ass, bald MFer hanging out to later be replaced by the normal SpongeBob characters. Placeholders in their simplest form can just be a default Unity character model, all the way to seeing characters in games they have no right being in. You can find some really cool Easter eggs just by looking at different games' placeholders. Hell, one of the most famous early Easter eggs comes from Doom, which is a placeholder text that reads, "I suck at making maps," and was never replaced. So yeah, there's a lot out there, and I'm sure we'll hit a few of the greats that I didn't mention here in the following layers. Another huge reason a game would have a large quantity of cut content is regional differences. The biggest reason for these cuts is to adapt the game to their respective markets, whether that's censoring things like sexual content or gore and blood. There are several reasons some games in certain regions seem very different from the same game in a different region. At best, this can show off some really cool artistic changes, and at worst, it completely changes the original idea of a character or concept to better fit sales markets. Like, why the hell does Kirby have to have a fucking attitude problem on most of his North American game box art releases? This usually isn't the worst kind of cut content, since there is a version that exists that has the original content, but yeah, this always sucks. It does happen less nowadays, but there is still certain games that just don't come out in certain places, so don't get me wrong, it's still a big issue in the industry. Concept art is a lot like tech demos. It gives you a great representation of what to expect from the final project, but don't focus on the details because they'll likely be changed at the final product. Concept art can reveal a lot about the game's development and what characters might have looked like early on. Things like enemies, bosses, and even main characters could look vastly different from their final designs based on concept art. Some really great ideas are lost in concept art, like the infamous Epic Mickey concept art, which depicts a much darker game than the actual game. Even if concept art isn't revealing cool details that were changed during the development process, it's still really cool to look at these, especially if you care about the game. Recently, I've been playing through the Donkey Kong Country Returns HD game, and one of the main collectibles throughout the game unlocks the game's concept art to view inside the game, which isn't done super often nowadays, and if it is, it's in a Game of the Year edition or extended edition or something like that. We'll talk about some more of the popular cases of differences in concept art to the final product, but just to cover this up top, this is a common source for unused content in video games. The cutting room floor is a main hub online for sourcing cut content. It's basically the Wikipedia for cut content in games and some other media. I've used this website as a source for information in countless videos, and if you're interested in cut content, you likely already are pretty familiar with the website. Most of the games that have their backends leaked online have a page on the cutting room floor. For example, here's the one for the aforementioned Mario Party 2. You can see things broken down into categories like unused models and graphics. If you're trying to become more educated in your downtime, this is a great website to scroll through, and instead of submitting to scrolling shorts or TikTok or something, learn about some cut content in video games instead. A back-end mole's wet dream is data leaks, especially with companies that are less than willing to share the makings of their games. One of the biggest leaks that happened in recent time occurred to none other than Nintendo, and it has been deemed the massive Gigaleak of 2020. This name was given due to how much data was leaked, upwards of 3 gigabytes, an unprecedented amount, especially for how much data 3 gigabytes worth of old game files makes up. It's a shit ton. The biggest leak occurred on July 24th, 2020, which gave the Nintendo community some insane shit we never knew existed, a lot of which will be covered in this iceberg, but to mention a few up top here, we got to finally see a game that ended up being Yoshi's Island, known as Super Donkey. Not only this, but we finally got to see prototypes for some of Nintendo's biggest games and franchises, including Pokemon, Mario Kart, and Super Mario 64, of which the last one had one of the biggest impacts due to the leak, as it finally revealed the existence of a character that was questioned to be in the game since the beginning. That, of course, being Luigi, the main man, the green guy. If you're not familiar, Luigi was always rumored to be in Super Mario 64. In fact, it was stated in an interview with Shigeru Miyamoto that was featured in a Japanese strategy guide for the game that Luigi was originally planned to be a playable character as a second player, but due to hardware limitations, he was cut. This is all word of mouth, but you know, it's believable because, I mean, it's Miyamoto. Sure, he lies about his alcoholism, but why would he lie about this? Plus, there was some evidence like this image from the Shoshinkai 1995 that would suggest he was a playable character at some point in the game's early development. However, it wasn't until the large Gigaleak that we finally got actual visual proof that Luigi was once in the game by finding his original files, including his character model. This was pretty big, it still is, and he definitely doesn't look all that different from the hundreds of Luigi retextures into the game from fans and mods. But simply having this exist is a huge deal, especially for us who fell for the rumors of Luigi being in the game back in the day. This is some sort of vindication almost 3 decades later. This is the sort of stuff that makes exploring cut content pretty cool to me. I'm not super familiar with Friday Night Funkin', so bear with me during these entries, as there are quite a few on this iceberg, and in fact I will go ahead and combine the next 2 entries into this one entry, as they are just smaller cut things from FNF. Friday Night Funkin' is a pre-release game that got its start on Newgrounds and is kickstarting a full release of the game. Therefore, unlike most of the games on this list, the cut content we'll talk about actually has a pretty good chance of maybe making it into the full version when that is released. Regardless, let's talk about the main character, Boyfriend. He is the one you'll be tearing it up 8 Mile style on the stage with. He has a few cut sprites and animations that can be found in the game, of which the majority show him attacking, dodging, and getting hit. I'm unsure why these went unused, but perhaps it will be used for another mode where the main character endures attacks or something. There was some mentions of a cut battle mode that they might be implementing into the full version, so perhaps these belong to that. The second piece of cut content from FNF is from Boyfriend's girlfriend, whose name is Girlfriend. They're not complicating things over here. She has a few cut voice clips that were intended to be used for cutscenes, but according to the wiki, text bubbles went unused in the game, causing these voice clips to not be needed anymore. They aren't even really voice clips, but more just grunts from Girlfriend, as the characters don't actually have voice acted lines in the game, so it's just more like Banjo-Kazooie noises. But yeah, this is some of the smaller cut content within Five Nights at Funkin'. And hey, with the full game on the horizon, they may not remain cut for very long. Undertale is already a super complicated game when trying to follow its world building and lore, but I'll try my best to explain this entry to the best of my ability. Throughout the later part of the game, your character will run into Alphys, who will help them during this section. If you explore around the level, you will begin to find strange journal entries written by Alphys, with there being 16 total to find in the game. However, due to digging around in the game's back end, players found that there was not only 1, but 2 cut entry 17 notes. These are denoted by entry 17 spelled out with letters and entry 17 with just the digits. Entry 17 was written by the character Gaster and doesn't really have anything to do with Alphys's other notes, with the following being stated in this one. Entry number 17, darker, darker, yet darker. The darkness keeps growing, the shadows cutting deeper. Photon readings negative. This next experiment seems very, very interesting. What do you two think? This entry is never explained further, and considering it can only be accessed by manipulating the game's save files room value or entering through the debug menu, it's likely this was another small side story that was scrapped. Nobody really knows what the experiment was or who the 2 people Gaster was talking to in this note, and we will likely not know what this note meant, as we were never supposed to see it anyway. The other note 17 is what I believe this entry is referring to, which is the final Alphys entry and would have been found in room 256 on a monitor that instead reads in the final game, DT extraction machine, dog treats extraction machine. That might actually be it with how many dogs are in this fucking game. Instead, it's theorized this monitor would have instead read Alphys's last entry, which is entry number 17. Monsters' physical forms can't handle determination like humans can. With too much determination, our bodies begin to break down. Everyone's melted together. Not only was the code hidden in early versions being replaced by the extraction machine note, but later versions of Undertale straight up removed this phrase from the back end, making it obvious it was purposeful. The developers decided to remove this note. The most accepted reason is it kind of ruins a big reveal moment that happens when Alphys confronts the main character, and it happened so soon after you would have found this note, it would have been worth the spoiler, so they decided to remove it. I've heard comments that Undertale, at least in its earliest states, the code was held together by duct tape and glue, and seeing stuff like this makes that statement even more true. Listen, I couldn't make my own Undertale, so I'm not judging, but it makes game development more relatable when simple mistakes like this make it through the cracks. It's totally something I'd do. Make some mysterious note and then accidentally leave it in the back end for everybody to find. Spaceworld is a trigger word for those interested in cut content, as it was an E3 before E3 was E3. This is where a lot of classic games were first shown in exhibit fashion, meaning these were the earliest versions of some of the best games like Super Mario 64 and the early Pokemon games. Since these are as old as I am, a lot of these demos are lost to time, and all that we have left of these builds is the little footage and images that were taken at these events themselves. Since then, there have been a few of these demos that have leaked online, with one of the biggest being the demo version of Pokemon Gold and Silver shown at Spaceworld 1997. This demo was the first showcase of the game and is drastically different from the last game, mostly visually, but there are some fundamental differences here as well. There's way too many small differences for me to go through everything, but a few highlights I found were different from the final release are some of the following. Some of the Pokemon's original designs just look straight up strange. Golem looks like he'll come to bake your cookies in the demo, meanwhile in the final game he looks like the badass rock monster he is. Marowak looks like a dog that got into the beehive and ate a shit ton of bees. You guys have seen those memes, right? Those pictures? The Muck, like Jesus fucking Christ. I get that's his hand, but come on, that just looks like he's straight up hanging brain. That's crazy. Besides the changes to the Pokemon we all know and love from the original generations, the game's backend also reveals completely original Pokemon that never got a spot in the long list of creatures we have today. One of the most interesting to me is another small electric Pokemon, kind of like Pikachu, that takes the form as a dwarf tiger of sort, known as Kotara for its first evolution and Raitora for its second evolution. There was also a cut ghost-type Pokemon that took the form as a full-on voodoo doll that would have eventually evolved into Qianpan, who takes the form of a Jiangshi, which is a vampire-like mythological creature from Chinese mythology, mixed with a cute panda, so, you know, it's not too spooky, haha. And hey, it wasn't only completely original Pokemon getting scrapped, as Pokemon like Ditto had scrapped evolutions that would have completely changed how you look at Ditto. I mean, this guy would have been sick. While there is a lot more differences in the Pokemon and other gameplay changes to see in the prototypes back in, we'll go ahead and move on because I could sit here all day and flame these fools. I mean, some of them are just jacked up. Minecraft has had a lot of content throughout the years that was just too ambitious to make it into the game, or were ideas that were shunned by developers themselves through corny-ass competitions, but we'll talk about that one later. One of the earliest pieces of cut content from Minecraft is known as the Giant Mob. This would have been a much larger version of the zombie mob in the game that would have had increased health and attributes more so than the regular mobs. This would have been a ridiculously sized mob, like we're talking Ant-Man and Civil War size, you know, almost disturbing if you have megalophobia. While the giant is technically impossible to spawn into the game, it's Minecraft, so nothing is impossible, and it was left this way by Notch. He stated that he needed to remove the giant due to it fundamentally not working in the game, but when it came time to remove the giant fully, Notch refused, stating, "They're just too cool to remove." I mean, he's just a lad, right? This is the same guy with the candy room as a mansion. It's a lad move. Not a lateral move, a lad move. Gee, what the fuck am I talking about? So by using the debug menu, you can easily spawn these giants, which take on the form of large base version of the default zombie skin. It's worth noting that if you change the base zombie skin texture, it will also change the giant, which is pretty awesome. I think honestly it's a bit of a shame that it was just an enlarged zombie, as the mere size of the guy is intimidating. They could have made a really gross, unique skin for the giant. Some Lord of the Rings shit. Still, seeing this thing spawn in caves and stuff is so surreal just due to his size. No pause. Fuck it, no pause. I think there is still a lot of potential with this mob, and I'd love to see him brought back in some capacity in a future update, perhaps as their own unique mob finally. I doubt it. We'll probably get crab mobs or some dumb shit soon. Unlike a lot of the cut mobs we'll be talking about in Minecraft through the rest of this iceberg, the Killer Bunny mob was actually present in the game at one time, but was removed pretty early on. Much like the giant, the Killer Bunny can still be spawned using stuff like commands, but they used to spawn like any other animal mob in the game. While there isn't a definitive reason they were removed, it's likely that they were too difficult a mob due to how quick and aggro they are. Don't get me wrong, like if you have fully enchanted diamond armor, these guys are a quick snack, but a common issue when these guys guys were in the game was spawn killing players. Like, as soon as you load up a brand new world, spawn killing. Since they weren't monsters, they could live during the day too, and if you were unlucky enough to run into a killer bunny, then you can get caught in a pretty dumb loop of dying to these guys on your spawn. I'd assume this one is one of the bigger reasons it got cut, but I could see them bringing these guys back in like another dimension, like the Nether or something, where it would make sense that the player would be able to defend themselves at that point in the game if they're at the Nether. They also had a very low spawn rate when they were in the game, unless of course you got extremely unlucky and got spawn camped by these guys. So the people who found them hated them, and the people who wanted to see them couldn't find them anyway, so no wonder really they didn't survive being cut. From 2017 to just last year, Minecraft ran something known as mob contests that would allow players to vote on their favorite new mob idea, usually out of a batch of 3 or 4. These would allow for player input into new stuff in the game and allow for developers to add in their ideas without much flack, that is, if it was a perfect world. Instead, we did end up getting the winner of these contests, but instead of adding in the losers at a later date, they got scrapped never to see the light of day again. I get it, not all of these were bangers, but from 2017 to 2023, we got several mobs that just won't ever be in the game, or at least there's no plans at all at this time for them being added. I'm going to highlight just a few here, but designs for all the cut mobs can be found online, as again, there was a bunch of them from all the mob contests over the years. Moo Blooms are from the 2020 mod contest and would have been a new cow variant that would have interacted with the bee mob in the game, and along with this addition would also come the addition of buttercups in the game, which I am partial to because that's my cat's name. I really like the glare mob's design, although I'm not surprised he came in last place during his mob contest, as his ability to help the player is damn near useless. He would basically be able to alert the player to potential dangerous mobs in dark places, which is everywhere that is dark. This might have been useful to help light things like your home, so you know for a fact you've lit up a place enough for mobs not to spawn, but overall he would have been pretty useless. But, you know, design-wise, I would have loved to see him as a hostile mob, maybe in some of the different nether biomes, fill those out a little bit more. Lastly, I'd like to highlight the Tough Golem from 2022's mob contest. The Sniffer ended up winning, which design-wise I really like. It looks like a Pokemon, but in terms of home protection, the Tough Golem, he's my winner all day. He basically acts as a mini-me version of the large iron golems you find in villages. When building the golem, if you add a wool to the creation, it would have given the little guy a little cloak matching the color of the wool block you used. It never directly stated that this guy would have been aggro to enemies and would have been used as protection, but I like to think he would have been. I also do like the idea of the golem being a statue until it's awoken, so half the time you can use it as a little display piece until it's time to rock and roll. Booyah! Yancey Street Dash right out and fucking kill that creeper. Pussy. Yeah, there's a lot more mobs that probably should have been in the game, but unfortunately they were beaten out. But for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Luckily, the mob contest ended in 2024 after some controversy, and the heads that work on Minecraft are reworking the way they will add future content. So hopefully we won't continue to see such good ideas be shown just to die. Banjo-Kazooie was super impressive for its time and really set a precedent for 3D platformers. That being, you don't need to be an Italian plumber to make a great adventure. You could even say that the game was ahead of its time, especially when considering what didn't make it into the game, the stuff that was too ambitious to come to fruition. One of the most popular and talked about online of these ideas was the stop and swap. The day I don't explain stop and swap in an Iceberg video is the day I stop making videos, I swear to God. Anyway, the basic idea was to allow players to collect items in Banjo-Kazooie and use them in Banjo-Tooie and possibly other Rareware games. This would have used a glitch in the Nintendo 64 hardware that would have left a certain amount of RAM after the game was taken out of the system, allowing for developers to think of stop and swap. Like the name implies, after collecting items in Banjo-Kazooie, you would then leave your N64 on and hot swap cartridges, allowing for the items to be present, then in the game you swap. Before the idea would come to full fruition, Nintendo shut this shit down. They asked that Rareware remove the feature as they didn't want to make light of the flaw, and they had already planned to remove removed the flaw from future iterations of the Nintendo 64. That would have made the mechanic not work with certain consoles, and that's just too much of a headache. Rareware did end up removing the idea, but not fully from the original Banjo-Kazooie. As case in point, you could still find certain items that Mumbo teases after getting 100% in the game. This includes a variety of colored eggs and a giant ice key. In the N64 version of the game, these items don't do anything, but if you played the Xbox Live Arcade re-releases of the games, then these items served a function which in a way re-implemented the original idea of stop and swap only a decade later, and much less impressive. These items would end up unlocking rare items in Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, so if you enjoyed that game, I guess there's that. In the original Banjo-Tooie, they brought back these bonus items, but with no intention of trying to stop and swap again, but rather they unlock specific bonus things in that game, like more moves and a dragon variation for Kazooie. Overall, I don't really blame Nintendo for making this call, telling Rareware to cut this. It seemed too ahead of its time, and since it was reliant on a hardware flaw, it was just too messy to be consistent enough for this to be a feature in the game. Nowadays, Stop and Swap is just themed DLC that you have to buy, but imagine if this actually worked out. You could store an AK in GTA 5 and go pick it up out of a cab in Red Dead. Let me introduce you fellas to something known as Full Auto. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 was the unfortunate victim of having quite a bit of material removed from its beta to its final release, with up to 5 whole zones missing that were supposed to be there. Worst of all of these levels, one known as Hidden Palace Zone, was used in early beta footage, the same footage they used for promotional materials they sent out, including images of the level. Yuji Naka claimed this zone and the 4 others were removed due to memory limitations, so it seems to be another closed case of overambition versus hardware limitations. However, the Hidden Palace Zone wouldn't remain in obscurity forever. First of all, it was brought back with the same name in Sonic & Knuckles, but not only that, the level was also brought back in the full version of the remaster of Sonic 2 that released in 2013. This was the first time the level was fully playable without restoring the level through hacking the ROM, and it seems to be the full level in the game. And this was probably pretty easy for them to do due to the fact the level was fully completed upon its removal. And we finally get to see this underground cave in all its glory, and man, it sucks they had to cut this level from the final version, as it's up there with one of the best from that game. If the Super Mario Bros. 2 was too hard for Westerners, was a piece of cut content, it'd be the decision to remove Stormy Ascent from the first Crash Bandicoot. Except instead of fear of it not selling as well due to its difficulty, the developers went ahead and said, ain't nobody gonna get this good, and removed the level. No amount of cranky memes can make somebody this good. To be fair to the developers, there was already a hardest level, quote unquote, in the first Crash, known as Slippery Climb, and having Stormy Ascent on top just seemed like kicking the player while they're down. A few Naughty Dog employees spoke on the level's execution on the chopping block when they said the following. Andy Gavin said, Stormy Ascent was just cut because it was too long and too hard and we ran out of time. Pause. I wish we had put it in as some kind of Easter egg, as it was an awesome level, one of my favorites in the game. Long, a bit brutal, but it looked great, and it had a real rhythm to it. Bro, come on, man. Of course, if you played the Crash trilogy that released in 2017, you know that Stormy Ascent has new life breathed into it. And man, the devs weren't lying. This stage is a prick and a half. That's what they were talking about, right? I played it because I went into the trilogy thinking I was about to easily 100% all 3 games in a couple weekends, clean it up, be done with it, and I still have never seen the end of the second game, and I've never even played the third. Yeah, the steam was cooked out of this guy right here at the end of the first game, and that's fully due to Stormy Ascent. Although, to speak on what Andy Gavin stated, it really is a fun level with a flow once you get a hold of the grueling platforming. Luckily, all these years later, the level got to see its flowers, and it makes you think of what other notoriously hard levels were cut for being too difficult. We wouldn't have the Battletoad speed racing section, the bitch-ass slime climb level from Donkey Kong Country 2, or what about all these dumb fucks? Yeah, I'm pretty glad difficulty in games isn't viewed the same as it was back then, as a deterrent, and hell, now it's a selling point of a game. Every AAA game right now wants to be Elden Ring. Hot coffee was perhaps one of the most controversial pieces of cut content you'll find in video games. If you're unfamiliar, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas included some content, including a sex minigame denoted as hot coffee, in which, for the time, it showed explicit sexual acts. Due to not wanting to risk a higher than M rating for the game, the mission was hidden inside the code, unavailable to anyone playing the base game. Due to them not removing the minigame in full and locking it behind the back end when the game's PC port was released, modders were able to restore the minigame to its full extent. The backlash from this being in the game seems silly compared to what's in games nowadays, but to be fair, Rockstar probably should have just removed the content altogether, but hitting them with a full course of the law for not properly advertising the content is also dumb. Listen, of course Rockstar recovered as a company, and it wouldn't be the last piece of controversy the series found itself in. It's super lame when government entities get involved and with no real way to access the content without knowing to mod it. I truly think it was a little bit of an overreaction, and if you're truly worried about kids seeing the scene and are totally okay with them doing everything else in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, reprioritize a little bit. If Rockstar somehow screws up and includes a full penetration cutscene in the back end of GTA 6, I don't know if anyone could go to the mats for Rockstar at that point. Just saying. The original version of Punch-Out had none other than Iron Mike Tyson as the final boss, and man, what a final boss he was. Imagine if Bowser was a real guy, and he was Bowser in the games. He fucked people up, and then you have to fight him in the game too. That's daunting, dude. What the fuck? This final boss has become unanimous with the other hardest NES segments of that era, and honestly, it may be easier to take down Mike in real life. At least now. Anyway, this version of Punch-Out has been deemed Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, as there was a re-release of the game in 1990 that ended up replacing Mike Tyson, as his contract with Nintendo had run out at the time, and due to his loss during the match with Buster Douglas, they decided not to re-sign the fighter. That and the subsequent legal issues, it was not in Nintendo's interest to continue putting Mike in their games, so they decided to re-release Punch-Out with a new final boss known as Mr. Dream. He is literally just Mike Tyson's boss battle with a reskin, like literally the same moves and everything. This makes him just as hard as Mike, but due to him looking like a default Fortnite skin and not being a real-life boxing champion, there was no staying power with Mr. Dream. While I don't blame Nintendo for the change, it definitely is lamer going against Mr. Dream, and seems a bit strange to re-release the game to get ahead of the contract expiring issue. A lot of the games are just lost due to that, but hey, it's Nintendo, so they probably used the time stone or some shit and saw into the future that they wouldn't be able to put Punch-Out onto the Nintendo Switch if they didn't take Tyson out of it. Real innovators over there. Rockstar games go through a lot of changes before their final releases, with some cut content making it to legendary internet status. A piece of cut content that has confused and creeped players out for a while is known as Darkel, where he would have appeared as a side character in Grand Theft Auto 3. Originally, it was thought that Darkel would serve as a mission giver in the main story, but was quickly benched and was used for side missions like the payphone missions and the kill frenzy missions. It was thought his larger role would act similar to the guider in the second GTA, who helps the player with introducing gameplay mechanics, parts of the city, and many other things. The reason for Darkel's exclusion isn't fully known, but there are several theories and some comments made from developers themselves about why. Seeing as the killing frenzy missions would have been terror-like missions where you would go around killing random civilians, it didn't seem in good taste to go through with these missions, and they decided to change them to rampages, which often targeted armed enemies. It seems the most likely reason is what developers said in a Rockstar Newswire Q&A, where they stated his removal was simply due to the fact he felt out of place compared to the other characters in the game. Considering Darkel's design and popularity online, I'd like to think the Blind Prophet from Red Dead 2 is a small reference to Darkel, but maybe that's just hopeful thinking. Rest in peace, Darkel. There'll never be a stranger GTA character that didn't make it into the game. Big caveat there. There's some strange motherfuckers in there that are in the game. Much like with Pokemon Gold demo getting leaked, early versions of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl were also leaked during the Nintendo Gigaleak. These came during the 2020 leaks and covered a few early versions of both games, with the earliest being the summer of 2006 build of the game. This version shows a lot of differences, too many to cover. Like with the Gold and Silver entry, I'm going to be talking about more visual changes specifically to Pokemon, which there are some pretty crazy differences this time around. It is worth noting that these were some of the earliest designs of these Pokemon, so while they are hilarious, these were likely never going to be the final designs for these Pokemon. As we could see, small details missing in these sprites like shading. I mean, some of these look like Miyamoto on a late night binge with Microsoft Paint. Take Probobass for example. I mean, his mugshot is bad enough, but look at his backhead shot, it's literally just a blue corner, versus this is what his final sprite looks like. Even more interesting though are some of the complete overhauls some popular Pokemon experience, like a complete color and shape change to Garchomp's evolution line. Or Rotom, he's just a piece of blue lightning and looks nothing like its final design. Regigigas here looks like you caught him sneaking into the kitchen at 2 AM to get a snack. Legendary Pokemon like Giratina are completely different in design, wherein the prototype resembled a fleshy griffin-like creature. Again, there are a lot of differences that are fun to look through here, so I highly recommend checking out the cutting room floor pages for more from this prototype. With this being my favorite Pokemon game, it's really cool to see what the game would have looked like, and man, in certain cases, I'm actually happy they finished the game the way they did.
What the hell is even that?
With a game like Cuphead, we were extremely lucky that the developers were super transparent about their development process, as with the degree they operate at, they could have easily sealed all of this information behind a giant cup vault or some shit. However, with things like the official art book and developers being super open about the development process, we have a lot to look at when it comes to Cuphead's early days. For this entry, we'll talk specifically about the unused bosses, of which there are a few, but this isn't the last time we're talking about Cuphead in this Iceberg. When it comes to Cuphead, I expected to see a lot more ideas that didn't come to fruition just due to time and money constraints, but surprisingly, the cut bosses we do have seem to have been cut late and have a lot to them, not just drawings on concept art. Take for example, originally Goopy Legrand had a twin who you would fight alongside him, making the original version of this boss fight much harder than the final decision to go mano-a-mano with Goopy. There are some bosses that seem to have been replaced with bosses later in the game, like the Dapper Spider here, probably was transformed into this asshole from the DLC. The Demon Bat fight we saw in early footage was either going to be the final boss, the devil himself, or might have served as a mini-boss before the devil, maybe even replacing the King Dice boss battle entirely. Take a boss like Jelly the Octopus, who's very unique to the battle itself, and they likely swapped him out for the Pirate Captain, or it may have been the fact that the boss battle wasn't super fleshed out to begin with. While there were plans to have more parrying challenges, having a full boss being defeated by a simple parry you repeat over and over doesn't sound super fun. He might have worked if they brought him back in the DLC in the parry challenge, but due to his theming, it would have been hard to work its design into the medieval style of that level. There are some other smaller mini-bosses that were cut as well, like the Pachinko boss that would have appeared in King Dice mini-boss section, or the cut section of the Root Pack boss featuring Betty Beat. Listen, all of these cuts probably serve to create a better final product, but anytime I see anything new in the Cuphead style, I can't help but want to experience it, even if it was just parrying an octopus's dumbass lantern head 20 times in a row. Sign me up. As someone who's put a lot of hours into Cuphead mastering routes and boss battles, the idea of new bosses is definitely tantalizing, but for me, changing the battles that already exist is even better. This is where the cut and unused weapons and charms would have come into play, and don't get me wrong, I get why they cut a lot of these. Like, they wouldn't be able to help you complete the tutorial or anything, they're not that overpowered, but some of these are crazy overpowered. I like to break down each cut weapon and charm individually and explain their uses because as a fan, this is some of the coolest shit to see. So let's go ahead and break some of these down. The float charm would allow the player to hold the jump button to slowly fall after jumping, helping for placement upon landing. Overall, this one wouldn't change too many of the bosses, but would just make platforming sections a little easier. The directional dash charm would act a lot like the dash charm, but would unlock 6 more directions, allowing for the player to dash in any direction they can aim. This one would actually kind of work, but at this point, I'd have to rewire my brain completely because I do rely on the dash when I play, and I've gotten used to the restrictions on movement with it. I mean, even just the footage showcasing this charm looks off. I get it's not fully animated or anything, but even if, I can't imagine dashing northeast and ending up behind the boss would help in many situations. The fast forward charm sadly doesn't speed up the time between the really easy parts of the grim matchstick boss fight and the impossible ending segment, but rather is a simple rate of fire upgrade. This would actually be a pretty clutch charm combined with certain weapons like spread. But yeah, this is a charm I could see that made the game too easy, especially since the only detriment is it takes up a charm slot. Another overpowered charm would have been known as Ghostly Touch charm that would have allowed your bullets on any weapons to phase through enemies and hit multiple at once. Again, do I need to mention weapons like Lob Shot being abused with charms like this? The shield charm would make it that every 30 seconds the player can become invincible for 5 seconds. These are starting to sound like kits for Marvel Rivals or Overwatch or something instead of Cuphead buffs, but yeah, this one isn't super egregious or overpowered or anything as it takes a long time to replenish, but I can't say there aren't times in Cuphead where I wish he'd just get tougher skin and take a couple shots on the face, unfazed. This charm is pretty simple as when you get hit, your power meter gives you 2 charges, so in a way it would be nice for charging ultimates, but overall that's not the best trade-off in my opinion. I guess if you're going to get hit anyway, like me and Grim Matchstick, then it's nice to have a little insurance charm. This charm is like when you mod Elden Ring to have multiplayer and you and your buddies just one-shot a really hard boss. The stapler charm allows the player to shoot both equipped weapons at once, but the caveat is that both weapon damages are cut in half. While this sounds like a pretty fair trade-off, the combined damage of the 2 weapons, even cut in half, will give you some pretty crazy outcomes. Not to mention making the screen a mess of colors as you unleash hell on a couple veggies. The spark weapon was a pretty simple weapon that shot out lightning bolts and had a pretty devastating special attack. The special would allow Cuphead to place stagnant lightning bolts that would attack enemies who walked into it. This may have been reworked into that one DLC weapon known as Converge, but that still works a little bit different than the spark weapon would have. The last cut piece of Cuphead content on the list today is probably the worst one in terms of use case. This would have cut out the gunplay of Cuphead and made it a true Dark Souls game, finally. All those headlines make sense now. Yeah, this is a melee weapon, and in a game where you want to stay away from your enemies as much as possible, this just doesn't make much sense. However, the challenges of the weapon may be what Cuphead veterans need at this point. Yeah, like how many no-hit challenges can you do before you cry yourself to sleep at night? There are other weapons and cut content from Cuphead that was probably worth mentioning here, but due to time, we'll move on to another entry. I do love the yap when it's something new I discover about one of my favorite games. Not many entries on this iceberg have reached meme status. That's safe to say, but that's not the case for the character known as Wheatley Crab from Portal 2. Wheatley is already a pretty prominent character in Portal 2, so there's no surprise there would be some cut and early unused animations to the small ball of sarcasm we all love. For whatever reason, the animation test where Wheatley changes into a crab became a prominent meme online a few years ago, with people making animations, songs, and other over-the-top edits for this strange cut animation. If this entry had not become such a big meme, it likely wouldn't have even been notable enough to talk about here, besides the fact that at some point Wheatley might have taken the form as a crab in early versions of Portal 2. As far as the actual animation tests go, they are pretty early on in the game's development and look like they were cut pretty early on as well. It wasn't until 2012 that the animations were dumped online, and it took another 8 years for the animation to grow into public view and become one of the greats, up there with the Dinosaur and 21 Kid. Everybody knows Wheatley Crab, right? I totally didn't just learn about it doing this iceberg. The earliest versions of Plants vs. Zombies had a dancing zombie that heavily resembled a real-life pop icon. This zombie would spawn 4 other zombies around it whenever it busted down a fat jig, so it's a pretty difficult foe to take down. Obviously, this is a direct reference to Michael Jackson's Thriller music video where he took the form of a zombie, and everything from the red leather suit, the hair, and white gloves, this is Michael Jackson, obviously. At first, this was just a playful reference to the famous music video, but unfortunately for PopCap, and well, Michael Jackson, he passed away only about a month after Plants vs. Zombies released. This was super unfortunate timing, as it now appears as though the game is mocking the fact that Michael Jackson died and representing him as the living dead, especially when the description for the zombie read the following: "Any resemblance between dancing zombie and persons living or dead is purely coincidental." Of course, the Jackson estate didn't look too kindly on PopCap and forced them to change the reference, and the dancing zombie is now just a generic disco dancer zombie. The Michael Jackson zombie can still be found in early versions of the game, but most modern releases have cut the reference. I think the Michael Jackson version is way more nostalgic, as I'm pretty sure I remember playing the game before it was removed. This guy this guy looks really familiar, but I totally get the optics of the timing of all this. It looked really bad, and they wanted to get ahead of any lawsuits by removing the content, so this one actually makes a lot of sense. If you're not familiar with SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom, many bosses in the game took form as robot versions of the main characters. There was a SpongeBot, Patbot, and even a Sandy robot to fight in the game. There was even a robot boss planned for Squidward known as Robo-Squidward, but was ultimately cut out of the console release. Robo-Squidward only ever appeared in early concept art for the game, where it shows that he would have been a pretty involved boss battle, having platforming play a pretty big role in the battle. The reason for his exclusion from the game was never officially confirmed by developers, but they were at least aware enough of the want from fans to fight Termisquidinator. That's because they brought this boss back, in a way, to the remake of the game Rehydrated. Unfortunately, even this didn't live up to fans' expectations, as he was sidelined to the boring-ass multiplayer mode where you don't even get to fight him, just as minions, while he stares down at you from above. A pretty big blunder overall, especially since I think they made a pretty big deal about this in the pre-release for the Rehydrated, but nonetheless, there are other versions of the Robot Squidward, like the GBA version of Battle for Bikini Bottom and Truth or Square, so it's not all bad. You can go fight Robo-Squidward somewhere else. One of the most sought-out prototypes was the original Sonic the Hedgehog, as it was strangely missing from the numerous other Sonic games that had their early versions and prototypes leaked online. That was until the turn of the new year in 2021, when the prototype was dropped on New Year's Day and revealed a lot about what the developers thought Sonic would be versus how it turned out, and defined the entire franchise. The prototype reveals how slow and more traditional a platforming game Sonic was originally built to be. The entire idea of going fast and maintaining speed wasn't always the idea around Sonic, as the prototype leans more on exploration. Other things in the prototype have revealed things that were only ever seen in early gameplay screenshots and magazines and early gameplay clips. For example, there were these boulders that were present in the first level Green Hill Zone that looked like they could be stood on by Sonic, like the apples in Mickey Mouse's Magical Quest. That's a really deep cut, but whatever, it works. A lot of the other differences are levels that aren't fully finished yet, like the Labyrinth Zone, that are completely missing the water in segments that you're supposed to be underwater. Hey, I'm happy for the Sonic community, as this was a big deal for fans of the older games and a great look into the development process of the very first game. Much like the Pokemon prototypes, I recommend checking out the cutting room floor page for this prototype if you want to see more changes from beta to final release. Back into the world of Friday Night Funkin', during week 4 of the game you'll run into Mommy Mirist. Can't make this shit up, who comes loaded with a squad of henchmen who are dancing, backing her up during her face-off. In the original design of the game, developers have confirmed that the henchmen would get hit and die due to not being smart enough to duck under passing lampposts, since the battle does take place on top of a speeding limo. It would have been like that one scene from Wolverine where he fakes that one guy out. It's a really goofy-ass conclusion to how intense that scene is. After the henchmen would get hit, they would replenish with new henchmen until it happened again, and really just served as background visuals. As of now, there has been no addition of this feature yet. Since it doesn't have an impact on gameplay, it's likely not high on the priority list for developers, but it does add an extra bit of humor and world building, so it might be worth adding one day. Like, yeah, these guys might be intimidating, but like in any other game, they are dumb goons who are expendable as fuck. The monster is the final boss and main antagonist to FNF, and went through quite a few designs before landing on the iconic lemon head design in the final game. We can see through concept art that monster's physical form wasn't even determined, as he takes form as many different alien life forms in this strange shadow tree coming out of a pumpkin. Like, what the fuck is this shit? They also have images used as inspiration for Monster, like this one of one of those creepy robot people who they barely do anything to cover up the real creepy robot face. This, combined with this tree design from the other concept art, landed Monster at this design with uncanny eyes, teeth lining the shadow tree, and just an overall feeling of dread when looking at this thing. I think it's more of a creative design for the monster than the one used, but I get that they might have wanted to ground the character to relate more to the other characters in the game. With how big the game's following is, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a mod out there that restores this original design in place of the final boss, but until then, don't forget, every villain is lemons. It was written in stone so many years ago, we should have seen it coming. Besides the uniform enemy design that your average Mario game would have, you can find some really cool, unique enemy designs in the series, especially ones that didn't make it into their respective games. Things like the Anus monster from Super Mario Sunshine, gotta love him, or the focus of this entry, Motos from Super Mario 64. Like the other uncovered secrets from Super Mario 64, these enemies were discovered in the 2020 leak and were given the name based on their coded name, SM64/shape/enemy-test/old/motos.sou. They resembled a couple of enemies from the final game while having their own unique design and moveset. The most likely outcome for the Motos was it turned into the bullies from Lethal Lava Land. This is due to the Motos files being found in files associated with Lethal Lava Land, plus their objective, which is to pick up and throw Mario into the fire, heavily resembles the bully star in Lethal Lava Land, with the star codename even being Big Motos in the game's code. They could also be related to Chuckya enemies in the game due to their main attack, which is very similar to Chuckya's, in which they pick up and toss Mario. Whatever these guys would be, they likely wouldn't have shown up too much in the game, and only in their respective levels like Lethal or even Bowser's Fire Sea. Design-wise, I actually really like their fat robotic design. It's super counterintuitive because look at his default animation. That just can't be comfortable. That's your everyday. As far as cut enemies and smaller content from Super Mario 64, this is one of the ones that has the most to look at, as it seems it was cut and replaced by one of the aforementioned enemies late into development. Listen, if you never played Portal, then these guys likely don't look super intimidating to you, but let's just say we're so lucky that the walking versions of these guys weren't added to the game. They are brutal and spell death for the player unless you can figure out a good way to get around them. Pretty late into development, a walking version of these turrets were in Portal with a pretty scary ability, the ability to follow you, even through portals. One of the best things about Portal is the ability to take your time to figure out the current puzzle. Trial and error. No worry of death unless you caused it yourself. Now imagine trying to figure out all these puzzles with this game's equivalent of Mr. X chasing you. According to early concept art and in-game renders, the turret would also be able to transform into fling mode or ball mode, where it would use this to fling itself through your portals. Karen Prell, an animator at Valve, stated in 2012 that the reason they cut the enemy was they favored the stagnant turrets, as the walking turrets didn't end up working well as an overall game mechanic. Honestly, I could see this as it would kind of break the Portal flow. Sure, maybe Portal veterans would like the extra challenge at this point, but the game is already hard enough trying to figure out these puzzles. Now add in the extra layer of trying to speed through the puzzles to save your own skin. It'd just be too difficult. I can't get the portal right. Fuck, he's coming. Like the giant from Minecraft, there's another enemy who is technically in the game but has never been officially implemented, making it only exist in the back end of the game. This enemy is known as the Illusioner and is an Illager variant that can attack in a variety of manners. Obviously taking the form as a magic threat, he will be equipped with spells and a bow that has a pretty high fire rate. His spells include the ability to blind a player for up to 20 seconds, which is pretty detrimental in the midst of battle. He can also duplicate himself through a spell where it will make copies of his current form and turn himself invisible. Other than him being overpowered, developers have likely just not found a good way to implement the Illusioner into Minecraft. The Illusioner is still being tinkered with in the back ends as of recently as 2019, so out of all of the mobs on this list, this guy might actually see the light of day at some point. There was even a video uploaded to the official Minecraft YouTube page where Jens, the lead designer of Minecraft, stated, "You will definitely be seeing more of him in the future," which that was only as of last year, so who knows, we might be seeing the Illusioner sooner than we expect. But until then, rest easy in the back end, my overpowered magical friend. Much like the Illusioner and the Giant before, the next missing mob in action currently exists in the game's backend but has never officially been added to the game. Story as old as time. This time it's a zombie variant of the horses in the game that took a similar form to the base zombie design with green skin and dark sunken eyes. Even though the horse does seem intimidating, it is peaceful through and through and won't aggro the player. The only real difference besides visual from the regular horses is the fact that zombie horses would be able to breathe underwater, which if you've ever tried to dredge a river with a horse in Minecraft, this actually sounds pretty nice. In terms of reasons they haven't added these dudes to the game yet isn't as obvious to me. Sure, they may have just fell by the wayside during development, but with the existence of skeleton horses, these make too much sense. Like other cut mobs, it's never impossible that these guys will be added in a future update, but considering how long they've been kept from the actual game, I'd say these guys are staying in the big Minecraft vault. It's right next to the Cuphead vault. The sky dimension in Minecraft is the last Minecraft topic we'll talk about today, but is one of the most unique pieces of cut content, and may have changed the Minecraft meta even today. The sky dimension was meant to act as the opposite to the nether that would exist above the clouds. If the nether was Minecraft's hell, the sky dimension is Minecraft heaven, which I need to find because I have a lot of pets that I need to apologize to that are up there. The sky dimension first came about when Notch was still working on the game and tweeted out an image of what the sky dimension would look like, and after a lot of great fan feedback, he responded by saying, "And because PC Gamer made such a big deal of the sky dimension, I guess I'll have to finish it. Consider it confirmed." After this, he started to speak publicly about the plans for the dimension and mentioned plans about how the player would arrive in the sky dimension, and it seemed to originally be a chance to spawn in the dimension when the player goes to sleep in the game at night. The same Jeb we talked about earlier stated his doubts with actually adding the dimension into the game, stating, "It didn't work so well because of how the light is calculated. The sky dimension originally had this top-down light from the overworld, so you get like shadows and caves and such. But performance-wise, it didn't work. It was extremely slow. So we removed the sun. Now everything is evenly lit unless you have a torch." After more time without announcements of the sky dimension, Jeb basically came out and said that they're no longer working towards adding it into the game. It's assumed that most of the sky dimension that was worked on was eventually turned into the End, which is also a floating sky island biome, and this is the final resting place of what once was the sky dimension. I mean, when you have developers come out and say they tried but it didn't work well, I think it makes sense to cut the biome, especially with how ambitious it was. You could still see what this dimension would have looked like by using data packs in the game or by simply adding a mod that recreates the sky dimension, and I must say, from the mods and original images, it is kind of a shame we didn't get the sky dimension just because of how beautiful it would look. It would be all of the best views in Minecraft, but all of the time, and who doesn't want that? Baldi's Basics fell into cult classic status pretty quickly, and there is surprisingly a lot to a game that looks like this. One of the most popular pieces of cut content from the game was a character/enemy known as PlaceFace. PlaceFace is a reskin form of the bully's head and heavily resembles a Mii character from the Nintendo Wii. PlaceFace is technically in the game, but is invisible and hidden from the player and has no actions that can affect the player, making him basically a cut character. He was one of the earliest characters developed before Baldi's Basics even began development and was used for AI testing. This test room can still be accessed in the game, meaning if you enter this jank-ass test room, you can finally face off against PlaceFace. He doesn't really do anything as he doesn't have a lot of programming, but there are scripts for him chasing you around. Considering the other characters in Baldi's Basics, PlaceFace seems like he'd fit in perfectly, honestly. But considering the bully is already present and they look similar, I can understand why he never made it into the game. Listen, I'm not going to do it because it's so stupid, but someone needs to make some PlaceFace placemats for their kitchen table just for the meme of it. Portal 2 was originally very different from what we know it as today in just about every department. The main reason for this was the presence of a character known as Mel, and I'm not talking Gibson. And she would have been the main protagonist instead of Shell in the final game. Her initial inclusion was to have a second human player for the two-player multiplayer in the game, but this was quickly replaced by the smart-ass robot duo Peabody and Atlas, which in turn also served the lore as these guys respawning constantly made more sense since they were easily replaceable robots, unlike humans when they die. Initially, Portal 2 was meant to be a prequel to the original Portal, and you would have played as Mel, who would have gone through the trials all the same as Shell in the first game. However, after negative feedback after playtesting over GLaDOS not recognizing the player, and it feeling so similar to the first game, they ended up going in another direction. After this playtest, they decided to completely scrap the prequel status of Portal 2, and instead went ahead making it a sequel and continuing Shell's story. Funnily enough, the developers left in voice lines for GLaDOS insulting the human duo in the multiplayer, and it weirdly still works for the two robots here.
Did you know humans frown on weight variances? If you want to upset a human, just say their weight variance is above or below the norm.
Overall, the exclusion of Mel isn't all that bad, as there have been fan creations that have taken her story into their own hands in a mod called Portal Stories Mel, so go check that out if this entry intrigued you. When it comes to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the list of characters who almost made it in the game but didn't isn't very long. I mean, of course you got your fan favorites, the Genos of the world. I mean, they got a lot of fighters in here, yet still no Walla. There are two fighters who almost got a place in Ultimate but were ultimately replaced for another fighter from their respective series. The first of these fighters was Alucard from the Castlevania series. He was considered, as Sakurai stated, he thinks he is one of the most popular Castlevania characters, but ultimately decided on Simon and Richter because he figured fans would prefer more characters with their move style. And I gotta say, even though the idea of Alucard would be dope, the last thing this game needs is another goddamn sword fighter. Plus, just use the shirtless Sephiroth skin and squint your eyes. There you go, it's Alucard. The next fighter who almost got a place in the game was Decidueye, who was replaced by Incineroar ultimately for the Gen 7 Pokemon representation. Unlike Alucard, where it'd be pretty easy to imagine what his moveset would be, the same can't really be said for Decidueye. Considering he is completely different from Incineroar, we missed out on what would have been a pretty unique fighter here. However, Sakurai stated that he was already looking for a character that he could make into a pro wrestler, and Incineroar fit that bill much more than Decidueye. Considering if these characters were in the game, they would have to replace the characters that are already in the game. I'm not going to say I'd rather these guys be in the game, but in a perfect world, these guys would have shown up anyway, or at least in one of the DLC packs. There's several reasons so far we've seen for content being cut, with some of the hardest to see being overpowered enemies. The Halo universe is already filled with a bunch of big-ass aliens to kill, but nothing I've seen has compared to the Flood Juggernaut. Just in terms of the design, this guy is clearly part of the Flood group of enemies, as he has one of the most surreal alien designs I've seen in Halo. Unfortunately for the Juggernaut, the developers had over-ambitious plans for him, of which would ultimately land the character cut from the final game. This enemy was meant to act as a mini-boss of sorts with a lot of health and even more moves on top of that. The Flood Juggernaut would have been devastating to fight against, as it would have been able to one-hit the player with either of its large tentacles, and could also one-hit you if it landed on you after jumping. This thing would have been a huge bullet sponge, as your best bet to take it down would have been explosives like grenades and rocket launchers. Unfortunately for the design team, it was just too much of an undertaking to implement the character, and he was left out of Halo 2. It wasn't the end for this enemy, as it ended up being used in Halo Fireteam Raven, an arcade rail shooter, which, man, it's quite the downgrade, but at least he made it into a game at the end of the day. In a game like Among Us, the character color doesn't actually matter in the overall gameplay of the game, but has quickly become a point of discussion, with certain colors seeming more trustworthy than others. One color that isn't even usable is one of the most sought after colors, known as Fort Green, and it would only appear as a placeholder color while the server waits for the player to connect. This would be accompanied by question marks for their name before the connection was successful and their true color was chosen. This seems like a nothing thing since it only appears on the screen for a couple seconds, but when it was removed in a later update, there were people who noticed. Since it was technically never in the game, I mean, how sad can you be? And it's also a shade of green when the game already has two other shades of green. So what are we really even talking about here? Undertale has a large number of cut enemies, of which we'll talk about a few in the next couple of entries, starting with Doge. Very much like the other dog in armor in the game, Lesser Dog, Doge would have worked very similarly, where to pacify them, you had to pet them and do other dog stuff, with one of their actions being a unique walk action. It's likely Doge would have been connected to Lesser Dog, as they both share design similarities as well as gameplay mechanics, i.e. how you fight them. According to the art book for Undertale, Toby the developer removed Doge due to her design not matching the other characters, as described to be too detailed compared to the rest of the unit. I do like the unique design of Doge, and it doesn't feel super out of place seeing how many dogs there are in the game, but yeah, compared to the other dogs, this one looks too much like a real life dog to really fit. Doge wasn't the only enemy that was cut from Undertale's world, as we take a look at the next entry. The Royal Guard was once rolling a lot more deep than they appear in the final game, as Royal Guard 3 and 4 were both removed. They would have shared the same battle similar to the first two Royal Guards, and would have had a very similar attack pattern with a couple of small changes. The pacifist way to take these guys down is quite odd and quirky, where you have to keep interacting with their gloves until you remove them, revealing that they both are wearing their best friend bracelets, which makes them diffuse the tension between them, resolving the fight as they decide to go get ice cream to celebrate their making up. Hell yeah. Again, this seems like the exact thing you'd run across in Undertale, but seeing as you already faced two other Royal Guards, it's likely these guys were removed just due to the repetitive nature of the battles. I do like the designs of the guards, as they are unique from the other guards, making them an absolute unit if they ever rolled 4 deep. They need to watch Fan 4 Stick, then they'll know truly how to work as a team.
Say that again?
If walking turrets weren't bad enough, developers thought it was a good idea to try and make another overpowered turret work, this time in Portal 2. These are known as hover turrets, and rather than taking on the form of other turrets in the series, it resembles that of the curiosity cords you can find during the final battle with GLaDOS. There are early screenshots that show the turret being able to be carried around and how they would be able to hover, quote unquote. They would have been suspended on wires from the roof and be able to trace the player with lasers tracking them if they get too close. The code for the hover turret still exists in the back end, but the original model is missing, causing a giant error texture to appear instead if you ever tried to put this thing into the final game. This is easily fixed with a mod you can get that restores the original model, so you can finally blow your face off playing with a hover turret in the test room. Team Fortress 2 has a nice banquet spread of classes and characters to play as. You could probably find one that suits your needs, but there was a chance there were going to be more in the game. Of the ones that didn't make it, we know about the existence of 3, which we'll break down shortly. Team Fortress 2 seems to be dead nowadays in terms of updates anyway, but back in its heyday, the want for new content was so real, with even some rumors of new classes being added. But alas, the base classes would be the only ones even to this day. Some of the worthy candidates lay in the back end, with one of the most notable ones being the Civilian. This character class is from the first Team Fortress and was meant to return as a playable payload in a new game mode in Team Fortress 2 known as VIP Escort. Unfortunately, Civilian nor the new game mode made it into the game, and there is very little evidence of the Civilian in the game's back end, besides it using a copy of the Scout's character model. The next cut class was known as the Commander and was meant to hang back and be more tactical, providing air support and communicating with the front line. In an interview with Robin Walker, he stated, "Our initial versions of TF2 were focused on trying to build a game around the concept of a commander, a single player who had a real-time strategy view of the battlefield. He would be responsible for building structures and providing a unifying strategy for the team, but there was significant design challenges involved. For instance, how do we design the game such that the commander can have fun at the same time ensure that the players down on the ground can have fun? How do we ensure that the players and the commander value output of each other? How do we ensure that the game is still fun if you have a terrible commander, or conversely, if you're a great commander with a terrible team?" Well, man, they still haven't figured that one out. I can tell you that 100%, man. We're still dealing with that even to this day.
You know, our job, our role, please.
How the fuck is this our fault when we're on the fucking point and you're over here doing God knows what?
Nobody can get. I'm the only one with fucking picks on the team besides the Magic.
So ultimately, this class was cut due to implementing complications, and instead the coaching feature replaced the need for this class in the end. Lastly, there were plans to add female variants for every class, headed by designer Drew Wolf, who made several concept images for the gender variants for all of the classes. The only model that was ever found in the back end for the game was for the Soldier, but it was never officially added to the game, and the decision ultimately fell through, cementing Team Fortress as a certified sausage fest. As I've stated, I'm a noob when it comes to these types of games, so anyone who's played TF2, let me know down below what you guys think of these cut characters and if you think they would have made worthy additions to the game or not. Mario Kart 64, or as it was known in its beta phase, Super Mario Kart R, had some notable differences from the final release, most notably being the character replacement of Kamek. Early character selection screenshots reveal that Kamek was one of the 8 playable characters, but it was ultimately replaced by Donkey Kong in the final game. Gotta say, it was a worthwhile replacement, but I still can't lie, Kamek would have gone really hard in this game. Also, I'd like to say Kamek isn't the only thing that's different about this character selection screen. It looks like every character here was just lined up in police custody and given a fake wheel to try and find out who did a Grand Theft Auto down off Toad's Turnpike. Kamek has since been added in via mods and has even made an appearance in games like Mario Kart Tour, but I don't know if that one really counts. But he did finally appear in Mario Kart 8 during a DLC pack, finally coming full circle and regaining his place in the race. I wonder if he's a nuisance towards Donkey Kong for taking his place all the way back then. I mean, everyone hates Donkey Kong in that game. He's such a little bitch. This next entry had potential to be one of the strangest crossovers they'd ever done, where they would have added an R-Wing from the Star Fox series into The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. That's right, a fully modeled, fully usable R-Wing from Star Fox 64 is in Ocarina of Time's backend and is fully fightable. While it seems like it was cut last minute, it was actually used as an early placeholder that would eventually be replaced by the boss enemy known as Volvagia, who used similar tracking to the R-Wing. This being the case, it's easy to replace the boss's model with the original R-Wing model to recreate this crazy-ass crossover. Hey look, this was the first ever attempt at a 3D Smash Bros. Game, and it goes hard as hell, I can't lie. As far as placeholders that eventually got cut, this one hurts the most, as this would have been epic as hell to see. And yeah, it would have been totally out of place in the game, don't get me wrong. But maybe if they added it in a secret room as a Easter egg boss fight, that would have been iconic, man. Regardless, it's cool to see these development methods like this, especially combining assets from classic games like these. Look, someone even modded in where you can fly around as the R-Wing and fight. You don't even have to be Link anymore. You can be the R-Wing. If you were lucky enough back in the day to play an early version of NBA Jam in the arcades, you were able to experience a crossover that might even be cooler than the R-Wing one we just talked about. In the first 2 revisions of NBA Jam, you could access secret characters that included a Grim Reaper, an ape Viking named Congo, and a few of the Mortal Kombat characters. Considering both games were arcade superstars, it's not surprising they'd want to have a crossover, and it seemed to have worked out great. That was, of course, until the NBA themselves found out and forced the developers to remove the secret characters. I'm unsure if it was based on the mature nature of the Mortal Kombat characters, or just the goofy-ass nature of running around the court as a Viking monkey. I mean, the first thing I think of when I think of Mortal Kombat characters being in NBA Jam is Shaq getting fatality'd and brought down to hell by Scorpion, only for him to rip out his heart. So I can't blame them if they wanted to represent a more realistic game of basketball here. However, the work that the developers put into this Easter egg that could have just simply been a reskin of other characters really makes it hurt that it got removed after the second revision of the game. Not only did the secret characters all have custom stats that were usually up to par or better than the best players in the game, but they could also pull off fatalities. You'd have to first put in a code on the character select screen, but after that you get a confirmation and you could start pulling off a fiery finisher on players during a game. This is the only fatality, and it doesn't actually kill the player or take them out of the game or anything, but rather shows a cool animation where the player is lit ablaze in a cartoony style. I feel like crossovers of this caliber can never happen today, and for the same reasons. Unless you're Fortnite, you're not going to see Blanca tearing it up on a Mario Kart track anytime soon. There's just too many conflict of interests. During the rough development process that was Metal Gear Solid 5's development, of course we have some content that should have been in the game but was cut due to time constraints and other issues. A huge piece of the story was an extra mission known as Episode 51 that would have filled in some plot points that were left unanswered in the final game. This is mainly what happened to the Metal Gear known as Sahelanthropus after the Children Gang ended up taking it. I played Metal Gear Solid 5, and I gotta say, even if I just 100%ed it yesterday, I don't know if I could tell you what the fuck's going on in this game. So I don't actually know the significance of the mission and the overall story, but to those who were able to find out what the fuck's going on, it seems like it should have been in the game. The mission was cut pretty early into the development and was meant to be used as a story DLC to wrap up the missing points in the story. But of course, with the messy public development of MGS5, that never came to fruition. Instead, upper level personnel at Konami made the call to scrap the mission entirely and threw all of the work of the mission onto a Blu-ray disc that covered the development of the game that shipped with the limited edition of Metal Gear Solid 5. With everything this game went through, I'm honestly surprised we're not missing more from the game. But for there to be a whole ass mission missing that seemed like it was mostly done seems like another big blunder for Konami at the time. One that many may not even have realized was cut and just assumed Metal Gear Solid 5's story left that much unsaid on purpose. I mean, it is Kojima we're dealing with. Nothing's black and white with him. That's all to say, if you could follow the story, which, I mean, the second I saw this, the game fucking lost me, man. A pretty crazy Mandela effect occurred when an image of the animatronics from the first Five Nights at Freddy's game surfaced that showed all of them staring at one of the security cameras. Many players are convinced they've seen this screen in the game, even though the image is impossible to have naturally pop up in the game and only exists in the back end. Some think that these people are confusing this image with the image of Freddy staring into the camera from the final game, but some are still convinced it's available in the mobile version. Listen, I'd rather not fact check this and download FNF on my phone, but perhaps it's in the mobile version, who knows? Maybe one of you guys know. Regardless, it's a pretty disturbing image, especially when you consider you'd be switching between cameras with a chance it jump scares you with all of them just staring past your soul. Listen, the image of Freddy catching you coming home at 2 a.m. breaking into your own house, it's already ominous enough, but you You get his buddies in there with him, and all of a sudden you feel like it's the worst sleep paralysis nightmare you've ever had. Then you add on top of the collective Mandela effect with so many players thinking they've seen this strange image in the game, you got an interesting piece of cut content here. Nintendo is known to bend to censoring certain things to attain better age ratings for better sales, and this applies to any aspect of any game. One of the more risque Nintendo characters, unsurprisingly, comes from the Fire Emblem series, and after past drama with censoring the character in Fire Emblem Awakening, another case of censorship popped up for the character, this time being in Super Smash Bros. For 3DS. The character was pretty prominent in the 3DS Fire Emblem game, so having a trophy of the character in the 3DS Smash Bros. Game just made sense. However, developers may have made it too much like her original design, as it caused it to be removed before the game's final release. The trophy was originally seen in the game fully modeled in the ESRB leak for the game, where you could see the trophy in a set of screenshots, where it was clearly there at some point. Fans were quick to notice the trophy's absence from the game when it came out, and they quickly assumed it was removed to obtain the E10+ rating it has instead of the typical T for teen rating. While this does sound like something Nintendo would totally do, there has been no official confirmation of why the trophy was cut. All things considered, unless this is your favorite Nintendo character, which I gotta say, you chose her over Chunky Kong, what the fuck's wrong with you? Then I don't think it's a huge deal to get into a fit over. It's a trophy in a fighting game. What, did you guys want to pull your route to a Smash Bros. Trophy? What are we talking about? Talk about the most down bad goonin' you've ever seen, dude. Back to the world of Cuphead real quick, we're talking about a smaller and lesser known piece of cut content known as turret birds. These would have been small minions who would have worked under the Wally Warbles boss fight. They would have been henchmen who would have stayed during the whole boss fight and acted as turrets who gunned down Cuphead, adding even more projectiles to this godforsaken boss. These would act very similar to the blimps from the Hildeberg fight, but were undefeatable. We could see modded footage of what these guys might have looked like in the fight, but unfortunately it never got a model made, so the modder just has a texture of the developer's head instead. As someone who's mastered the Wally Warbles fight, even to me, adding these turrets in would have made the boss fight even more of a bullet hell than it already is, and way too fucking hard. In terms of being annoying, the whole fight has plenty of tough phases. I couldn't imagine him having turrets equipped while doing all of this. I would have liked to see what these guys would have looked like though. I'd like to think it's just be buff eagles that would have Gatling guns or something, but who knows, it'd probably be a little closer to this loser right here. When it comes to the Telltale games, it's no surprise that the stories go through a lot of changes throughout development as they lean heavily on telling a story, so changing the story to flow better is almost necessary in games like this. Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1 had its fair share of huge story changes that would have completely changed how the game went and the fates of certain characters. I'll just cover a few of the bigger story beat differences, but there are quite a few, and it's fun to imagine what the game would have been like had these changes not happened. All your favorite characters died. Oh wait, that happened anyway. Kitty was supposed to die when he was saving Ben or Krista, but instead he got to live a little bit longer, just a little bit. Your boy was out there for a little bit longer. Then there was Lily, who was supposed to show up at the RV in episode 5 and might have helped out Clementine there. The character Molly was supposed to kill herself, but this was removed, probably for being too graphic or something. But yeah, those are some of the bigger changes that might have affected the final story of Season 1 of The Walking Dead. And as it's been a long time since I played the first season, I do forget smaller details, but in a game like this, tripping on a rock could spell your fucking doom, so these changes would have made a completely different experience, for better or worse. Alright, that'll do it for today's video. We'll cover the next 2 layers in the next video and we'll go from there. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see other Iceberg content, check out my playlist down below to see them all. And I'm talking all of them, even the shitty first ones I did. In the meantime, if you'd like to check out my other content, I do gameplay videos, list videos like creepy Easter eggs, bad endings in games, all that good stuff. And other content on my members channel if you'd like to support the channel in another way, that's there as well. But that'll be it for me today. Hope you enjoyed, hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.